The mysterious Hobbit species, an ancient human ancestor that stood just 3.5 feet tall, was discovered in 2004 when archaeologists searching a cave on an Indonesian island found a 60,000-year-old skull no bigger than a grapefruit. Some researchers now believe the ancient species may have evolved its short stature because it lived on an island for hundreds of thousands of years, completely isolated from the rest of the world. The discovery of Flores Man. The Indonesian island of Flores, located between Sumatra and East Timor, has become the center of a huge controversy over the last few years. In September 2003, a joint international research team from the Indonesia Center for Archaeology and Michael Morwood from the University of New England, Armidale, were excavating at a large limestone cave called Liang Bua. At a depth of about 20 feet, they discovered the near-complete skeleton of a woman of around 30 years of age. The skeleton, which looked to them like a species of hominid, was found to be only 3.6 feet tall. Other scattered bones of the same species were found nearby, and eventually bones representing 9 individuals were discovered. Using radiocarbon and thermoluminescence dating, the oldest remains were dated to about 94,000 years ago, and the most recent to 12,000 years ago. The extraordinary late date for the survival of Flores Man, though, is controversial. A recent re-examination of the bones from the cave dated the youngest remains to sensationally as early as 700,000 years ago, although most of the finds are between 100,000 and 60,000 years old, and the youngest stone tools to about 50,000 years ago. Most researchers believe the previous estimate of 12,000 BC was caused by an undetected unconformity in the cave's stratigraphy. The disappearance of Flores Man from the fossil record is close to the time that modern humans reached the area, suggesting to some scholars that the initial encounter may have caused or contributed to their ultimate extinction. Also found in the cave in association with the hominid were the remains of fish, frogs, snakes, tortoises, giant rats, birds and bats, plus larger animals such as a dwarf species of stegodon, an extinct pygmy elephant, Komodo dragon, and a larger lizard. The discovery of pieces of fire-cracked rock and charred bone in levels containing hominid skeletal materials suggests that the Floresians knew how to control fire. Another significant find in the cave was a relatively sophisticated stone tool assemblage, including small blades which could have been mounted on wooden shafts. Some of the tools were found in direct association with the stegodon, which suggests that the Floresians were hunting them. The team published their amazing findings in October 2004 in the science journal Nature. The conclusions they drew from the discoveries on Flores were incredible to say the least. It was announced that a new species of tiny humans, which they named Homo florensis, had been discovered. The original skeleton became known as the Lady of Flores, or LB1, and the species nicknamed Hobbits, from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books. All the individuals were about 3.3 to 3.6 feet tall, with long arms, grapefruit-sized skulls. They were fully bipedal, but had an extremely small brain size of 380 cubic centimeters, about a third of that of modern humans, and slightly smaller than a chimpanzee. They made sophisticated tools, hunted miniature elephants, and were living at the same time as modern humans were colonizing the area. The researchers concluded that the Floresians were not a pygmy form of modern humans, but a scaled-down form of Homo erectus, the eastern relation to European Neanderthals who were wiped out by modern humans about 30,000 years ago. Homo erectus also disappeared from the record just before modern humans arrive in their territory. Controversy over Flores Man. The completely unexpected discovery of Homo florensiensis is widely considered the most important of its kind in recent history. The new member of the genus Homo could even change our understanding of human evolution. For example, we are inclined to believe that sophisticated tool manufacture requires a large brain, but the minute brain possessed by the Lady of Flores challenges this and suggests that researchers need to question previously held assumptions regarding the intelligence and capabilities of our tiny-brained ancestors. One of the original discoverers, Dr. Michael Morwood, even believes that the Floresians may have had a primitive language which they used to communicate during elephant and giant lizard hunts. But others disagree and point to the fact that chimps and even wolves can hunt cooperatively without the use of language. There were, and still are, many who disagree strongly with the conclusions drawn from the finds in the Luang Bua cave. Indonesia's foremost paleoanthropologist, Tuku Jacob, has claimed that LB2 was not a member of a new species at all, but belonged to another race of modern humans and was thus merely 1300 to 1800 years ago. Jacob and several other prominent researchers believe that the bones are really those of a modern human, Homo sapiens, most likely a pygmy, with a brain defect known as microcephaly. It has even been suggested that the bones belong to ancestors of modern-day pygmy inhabitants of the Flores village of Rampasasa, close to the Luang Bua cave site. Microcephaly is a pathological condition characterized by an unusually small head and brain, and frequently associated with mental difficulties. In support of this theory, anatomist Michael Hennenberg has claimed that the LB1 skull is almost identical to that of a microcephalic example from Greece. However, Peter Brown, the main contributor to the original Nature article and an associate professor at the University of New England in New South Wales, rejects this explanation. He reasons that very few humans with this condition actually reached adulthood, and that the skulls display a range of distinctive features, none of which are found in LB1. Brown also states that as there are new bones from Liang Bua representing 9 individuals, all sharing the same tiny features, it is more difficult to propose that the whole population suffered from microcephaly. In early 2005, an independent team of international experts led by Dr. Dean Falk from the Florida State University examined the skull of LB1. They published their results in the journal Science. In March 2005, the team compared a three-dimensional image of the brain of LB1 with those from a number of different species: a chimpanzee, a modern human, including a modern pygmy, a microcephalic, and Homo erectus. There were further comparisons with primitive-like creatures and also with modern gorillas. Their conclusion was that the LB1 brain was completely unlike that of a pygmy, and most like that of Homo erectus, and it is indeed a new species of human beings. But these results didn't silence the critics, who claim that Dr. Falk and her team didn't use the skull with the correct example of microcephaly. So the controversy continues. There is a strong possibility that the question of the true origins and identity of the Floresians might be cleared up by using DNA analysis. The comparatively recent age of the skeletal materials and the fact that it is not fossilized might suggest that this could indeed be done. However, as high temperatures degrade DNA, the tropical climate of Indonesia significantly diminishes the chance of success with this method. Perhaps additional finds of more complete skeletal materials from Liang Bua may allow DNA testing, though only time will tell if they can ever be successfully extracted from LB1. Nevertheless, the fascinating possibility remains. If DNA could ever be extracted, it could provide an entirely new perception of the evolution of the human lineage. Legends of Flores Man. Interestingly, the modern inhabitants of Flores have detailed legends about the existence of little hairy people on the island, known as Ibu Gogo, roughly translated as grandmother who eats anything. Some of the features of these Ibu Gogo, a height of about 3.3 feet and longish arms and fingers, are also characteristic of Homo floresiensis. The Ibu Gogo were also able to murmur to each other in some kind of primitive language and could repeat what villagers said to them in a parrot-like fashion. Are these perhaps echoes of Dr. Michael Morwood's ideas that the little Floresians would have needed a language to hunt as they did? Apparently the Ibu Gogo were last sighted just before Dutch colonists settled in Flores in the 19th century. There is also an interesting link between the Floresians and the island of Sumatra, where there have been reports of other 3.3 feet tall humanoid known as the orange pendek. Zoologists have been cataloguing sightings of a mysterious ape in western Sumatra for over 150 years. and both footprints and hairs have been recovered that may belong to the creature. Researchers working on the Floresian finds have postulated that the orang pendek could be surviving examples of Homo floresiensis still living on Sumatra. Mystery solved. One important question about the discovery of Flores man is how the researchers account for the small size of Homo floresiensis. One recent theory is that the island of Flores is particularly isolated and, before modern times, was inhabited only by a limited group of animals that had managed to reach it. These animals subsequently became the subject to unusual evolutionary forces that drove some towards giantism, the giant lizard or Komodo dragon, which is still alive today, and reduced the size of others, the pygmy elephant, for example. The original excavation that discovered Flores man think that they were descendants of Homo erectus, who may have arrived on Flores about 840,000 years ago, and isolated on the island, they gradually evolved their tiny physique, undergoing the same adaptive process that reduced the size of elephants. The small size may well have been evolved due to the shortage of resources on Flores. Pygmies, standing no taller than 5 feet, these little people of ethnic origin appear to have been roaming the earth for countless centuries. The term usually refers to the small-statured hunter-gatherers of Africa, but pygmies can be found in many parts of the world. The term was first coined by the ancient Greek poet Homer, who reported seeing tribes of these little people while he was living in India and Ethiopia. So where do they originally come from? It's long been a mystery. Some researchers argue that their height is inherited from a common ancestor, while others believe that their stature evolved independently among different tribes. During childhood, their growth is completely normal. However, when they reach adolescence, they miss that final growth spurt. Being small could be an advantage in the forest, as there is less food and you need less of it. You'd produce less heat, though, which would be an advantage when living in a humid rainforest. If that wasn't enough, you'd also be more agile, and it would therefore be easier to climb trees and move through dense shrubbery. Because of the secretive nature of many tribes, it's very difficult to estimate just how many pygmies roam the earth today. But Jerome Lewis of University College in London states that Central Africa's pygmy population, somewhere in the region of 500 to 900,000 people, is on a genealogical par with the San of Southern Africa. They are, in effect, who we are all related to. These are civilizations that make ancient Egypt look like a spring chicken. Strangely, the pygmies of Southeast Asia share similar attributes to those of Africa, which makes some explorers wonder whether they originally came from Africa and migrated at some point. Anthropologists, however, argue that, despite the similarities in skin tone, hair, and tissue, the resemblance is probably due to living in similar environments. While we can say with absolute certainty that these little people exist in Africa and Southeast Asia today, there is a debate as to whether they ever roamed North America. Did a race of pygmies once inhabit the fertile woodlands of the Cumberland Valley, part of the great Appalachian Valley in Pennsylvania, USA? The writings of early American historians and archaeologists provide abundant evidence, proving that the tribes of diminutive people did indeed live in the region centuries ago. The colonists who settled in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee heard many fantastic stories from the local Native Americans. The most prevalent legend described tribes of fierce, uncivilized little people who occupied the area when the natives arrived. They were quick to point out that this race was distinct from their own form of fairies, who were a supernatural folk believed to be in existence when the colonists arrived. The colonists had little time to listen to the ravings of the natives, whom they labeled savages. They had to cut down forests, plough the earth, and plant crops, and that's when the colonists became believers. They dug up the many tiny skeletons. The earliest were discovered in Sparta, Tennessee in 1828, when several burial grounds were found. Each was at least half an acre in size and contained small skeletons of adult human beings. The bodies, the tallest only 19 inches in height, had been buried in shallow stone coffins which were arranged in neat rows. Every skeleton had to be laid on its back, hands neatly folded over the chest, and its head positioned to point forward to the east. Each pygmy skeleton was holding a jar, carved from grey shell, in the crook of its left arm. The jars were pint-sized, but the only objects found inside them were 3 shells apiece. No metal was found among the burial implements, not even the crudely pounded copper ornaments which the Indians had used. One pygmy was buried with a string of 94 pearl beads around its neck. Modern archaeologists tell us that these are the remains of people who had been stripped of their flesh and buried in a double-up position. It seems unlikely that entire graveyards would be reserved for children, and the report clearly states that the bodies were laid out in full length on stone tables. Furthermore, the little bodies were described as well-formed, the bones strong and fully developed. They were neither children, deformed dwarfs, nor flesh-denuded adults. They were fully grown adult pygmies. Dr. S.P. Hildreth, a professional naturalist and archaeologist of the early 19th century, investigated numerous Aboriginal remains in the Ohio, Adena, Mound Builder area. A native of Marietta, Ohio, an area rich in prehistoric ruins, Hildreth made several startling discoveries when he toured the state in 1835. 1 mile below the city of Coshocton, on a bluff which overlooks the Kilbrook River, he located what is known as a pygmy cemetery. The cemetery consisted of more than 3,000 stone-covered graves, each containing a skeleton of very short stature. Traces of wood discovered around the bones indicated that the pygmies had been buried in coffins. The bodies ranged in size, from 3 to 4.5 feet in length. Many skeletons were recovered, tenants of a considerable city, as Hildreth put it. He personally opened many of the graves himself, and without a single exception, they had all contained pygmy remains. Like many of the Tennessee tribes, these little people also had been buried in stone tombs, although their actual burial vessels were wooden coffins. They were also quite a bit taller than their relatives at Sparta. This pygmy cemetery is now mouldering beneath a farm, a fate it shares with many of America's priceless prehistoric treasures. One concession made by the state's Historical Society is a small marble marker, which commemorates the site as being prehistoric in origin. In his account of the Ohio Pygmies, Hildreth mentioned a large pygmy cemetery which was located near St. Louis. This fact was substantiated by C.B. Walker in his book, The Mississippi Valley and Prehistoric Events, published in 1880. In it, Walker described small coffins which contained the remains of short people found beneath small mounds of earth. As in many other cases, he wrote, at different points in the valley, these bodies were protected by flat stones which were so placed as to form a coffin or sarcophagus. Walker then explained how archaeologists had tried to claim the skeletons were those of children, but he noted the preserved crania indicates ordinary size. In other words, they were the fully developed skulls of adults, not children. In 1883, more pygmy remains were found in Kentucky and Tennessee. These had been buried in stone tombs 18 inches deep, along with brandished weapons. At the search in 1885, their skeletons again came to light in Ohio's Cumberland Valley, not far from the great mounds of that state. However, these mounds should not be attributed to the pygmies, as several writers have proposed, because there is abundant evidence to prove that they were built by a much later race of Native Americans. Various Native American tribes have spoken of a smaller, ancient subspecies of human living alongside them. A common occurrence in these accounts is their mischievous behavior. Indeed, some natives, like the Crow tribe, even believe these pygmies to be dangerous. To this day, the Pryor Mountains are supposedly still home to the spirit dwarfs, as they're known. The Crow tribe claim to be related to them, but are very reluctant to enter their territory. Considering that the Pryor Mountains are well known for strange cases, like disappearances and mysterious sightings, you can't blame them for being wary. One typical legend that describes contact between pygmies and Native Americans comes from the Cherokee, who were then located in northeast Georgia. The incident took place at Tallulah Falls, a natural wonder, which became famous several years ago when the renowned high wire artist, the Great Wallenda, as he was called, crossed the gorge on a tightrope. The word Tallulah translates from the Cherokee language as the Terrible, an accurate description of that wild area. An ancient Native American legend related to early Caucasian settlers told of a hunting expedition which was led to Tallulah by the best hunters of the Cherokee Nation. When the party failed to return, a cautious group of medicine men was sent out to search for them. The medicine men were gone for a full month, and when they finally arrived back at the village, they had some horrifying news to tell. A priest had stumbled upon a deep fissure in a desolate region, from which a mountain torrent fell with a tremendous noise. He described the local inhabitants as a species of little men and women who dwelt in the crevices of the rocks and in grottos under the great waterfalls. The medicine men vainly attempted to communicate with the savage pygmies. The little people spoke in shrieks and brandished weapons at the search party, so they returned home to bring bad news to the hunters' families. The official report was that the little people had killed the hunters and would also have murdered the medicine men if they had not been protected by their mysterious powers. Afterwards, the Cherokee carefully avoided the region. Recently, archaeologists have explored caverns in the Tallulah Gorge area and have unearthed artifacts from an unidentified culture. Antiquarians had previously thought that no Native Americans had ever lived in the gorge, and stated that the artifacts were definitely not related to any known Native American tribe. In addition, at Track Rock Gap in the nearby Blue Ridge Mountains, there's a series of soapstone boulders which have been engraved with ancient symbols. They are said to be the work of the Old People, a range of pygmies who originally settled in the country. Where the pygmies came from, as well as when they arrived in North America, are questions likely to remain unanswered. We do know that they were wiped out long before the European area by other tribes of Native Americans, but that is the extent of our knowledge. Besides legends and many burial grounds which reveal little of their culture, we have no information regarding this vanished race of small folk who, without doubt, once inhabited prehistoric America. Vanished? Or simply not found? Surely this deserves more attention, and if further evidence comes to light, we'll be certain to tell you about it here. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, are now the only surviving member of the Homo genus. It's almost inconceivable to us that there was a time we walked with other human species. But as the science of archaeology has progressed and more findings have been made, it has become clear that the Homo genus was once rife with different species. Since the publication of Darwin's On Origin of the Species in 1859, there has been great interest in piecing together our family tree. Fossil hominids like Lucy and Java Man have helped us to fill in some of the blanks, but as more and more remains of extinct human species have been discovered, it has become clear that the history of our ancestors and how they evolved is not as simple as may once have been thought. Our family tree is now filled with not only direct ancestors like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, but also cousins and distant relatives. But despite so many extinct human species now being known, there are still gaps in the picture. And even though we have remains and evidence of some species, we know very little about them. Homo heidelbergensis, Heidelberg man. This extinct human ancestor walked on Earth about 600,000 years ago in Africa, parts of Asia and Europe. They are believed to be the direct ancestor of Neanderthals, and some archaeologists even argue that they are archaic or early Neanderthals. Heidelberg man was exceptionally tall at an average height of 6 feet, but also intelligent. They were using stone-tipped spears made from obsidian to hunt and butcher large prey, and may be the first species of Homo to intentionally bury their dead. Homo rudolfensis. This extinct human ancestor is only known through a small number of fossilized bone fragments. There has been some debate as to whether rudolfensis is the earliest known member of the Homo genus, or if it is a very late member of the Australopithecus gene. Due to the scant nature of the remains, not much is known about the species, but evidence suggests its brain was proportionately larger than other earliest members of the Homo genus. Java man. In the early 1890s, the tool, skullcap and thigh bone of an extinct human species were found by a team of archaeologists in East Java. This is what gave the discovery its nickname, Java man. It was a big deal at the time as the bones were at the point of the oldest hominid remains ever discovered. It was originally argued by some archaeologists that Java man was an ancestor of Homo erectus, but there were some who said that it was the so-called missing link between ape and man. Boskop man. Boskop man was discovered in 1913 in Boskop, South Africa. It's notable as the brain size of the skull was larger than that of a modern human. After other specimens of the species were discovered, it was given the name Homo capensis. However, after heavy criticism in the 1950s, there was a change of opinion, and the Boskop man, along with the rest of Homo capensis, was reclassified as anatomically modern Homo sapiens and not an extinct ancestor at all, despite an estimated head size of 30% larger than the modern average. Homo denisova. One of the more recent discoveries of an extinct human species was made at the Denisova cave in Siberia as recently as 2008. Only a very few remains have been discovered so far, but thanks to advances in DNA analysis, it has been possible to sequence the genome of Homo denisova. With this evidence, it has been possible to show that some people in Tibet have snippets of Denisovan DNA in the same way that some Europeans have a tiny percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Penghu man. Another extinct human found in 2008 was Penghu man. Penghu man's fossilized mandible was discovered by fishermen working near the Penghu Islands off the coast of Taiwan. It's extremely thick and has gigantic teeth, which has puzzled scientists for several reasons. They have been able to determine it is the mandible of a previously unknown species and that it was possibly very similar to Homo erectus, but larger. It has so far not been possible to date the fossil, so they're not sure when the species was alive. Dmanisi man. Homo georgicus, otherwise known as Demishi man, is a species of extinct human which has been found in Demishi, Georgia. The species has a very small brain, unlike many of our extinct ancestors. The 5 skulls, which are evidence of Homo georgicus, were discovered in 1991, and since then they have been the subject of much debate. There may be an intermediary between Homo erectus and Homo habilis, but there are some scientists who think that the skulls are simply examples of Homo erectus. Despite having a small brain, the fossils are associated with a total of 73 tools, which proves a large brain is not always necessary to use and produce tools. Red Deer cave people. The most recent known archaic human to go extinct, the remains of the Red Deer cave people, have been dated to approximately 11,500 years ago, meaning they were still around for about 28,500 years after the last pure Neanderthals. Some scientists think the Red Deer cave people were a hybrid of Homo denisova and modern humans, but attempts to sequence their DNA have not proved successful, so it is currently impossible to say for sure. Homo naledi. Evidence of Homo naledi was unearthed in 2013 in a cave in South Africa by cavers who were able to access a chamber of the rising star system for the first time. 30 meters, 98 feet below the surface, it is strewn with thousands of bones which have unique and interesting features, with 1,550 currently excavated and many more remaining in the cave. Some of their features are archaic and resemble specimens from around 20 million years ago. But they also have more modern hominid features, and their bones have been dated to about 250,000 years ago. It has been concluded that they were not a direct ancestor of modern humans. Archaeologists are unsure how so many bones ended up in the cave. but they may have been desperately depositing the bodies there at a time of death, as there is evidence that they were not deposited at one time. The Hobbit. In 2004, researchers made the announcement that a discovery had been made on the island of Flores, Indonesia. The people on the island had long talked of the Ibu Gogo, a supposed race of short, hairy men who lived in caves. Astonishingly, the discovery of stone tools and the remains of a small hominid in a cave on the island seemed to prove the legends right. The remains were given the official name of Homo floresiensis after the island, but they have become known as the Hobbits. Homo floresiensis was approximately 3.5 feet tall with large feet. The Hobbit had very primitive features and a small brain, like our earliest ancestors, but they were able to use tools and may also have been able to hunt and use fire. The Ghost Ancestor. A study published in 2019 has shared evidence of a yet undiscovered extinct human ancestor, proposed after an AI program determined that there was a ghost population of archaic humans which interbred with modern humans in the distant past. Researchers think the unknown ancestor may have been an offshoot of Homo denisova, based on the evidence. With such techniques such as this, and advances in fields such as DNA analysis, it's now possible to learn more about extinct species of humans than ever before. New species are being discovered and identified with relative frequency, and the earliest discoveries can now be reassessed and analyzed in greater detail. The evidence is pointing not to one unbroken chain of human ancestors, but to a rich family tree with a number of offshoots. Exactly how many extinct relatives we have, we'll probably never know for sure, but with each discovery, we're able to add a unique and new piece to the puzzle of who we are. The question of when and how the continent of Australia was first populated has always been a bit of a puzzle to archaeologists, but recently some new light has been shed on the problem. An international team of archaeologists, geographers, ecologists and computer scientists mapped the probable superhighways that led to the first peopling of the Australian continent around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. The team generated a fascinating map which reveals these migration superhighways traversed by early humans in Australia, which mysteriously bear striking similarities to Australia's modern highways and stock routes. Some researchers have also suggested a connection between these newly discovered superhighways and the mysterious Aboriginal dreaming tracks. Over the years, there have been many theories about where the indigenous ancestors first settled in Australia tens of thousands of years ago, but evidence for this activity is extremely scarce. Only a very small number of archaeological sites date from these early times when sea levels were much lower and northern Australia was joined by a land bridge to present-day southern New Guinea and eastern Indonesia, and people and animals were able to walk at various times across to Tasmania from the mainland. This megacontinent, known as Sahul, was 30% larger than Australia is today. One of these early archaeological sites was at the now dry Lake Mungo in western New South Wales. Here, in 1968, Earth scientist Jim Bowler uncovered the cremated remains of an Aboriginal woman in an eroding dune close to the shoreline of the lake. In 1974, the ancient remains of a man were found nearby. Both of these remains, now called Mungo Lady and Mungo Man, were found to date back to a staggering 40,000 years, thus doubling scientific estimates of how long Aboriginal people had lived in Australia. The amazing discoveries at Lake Mungo reveal that Aboriginal history stretched back at times so remote that the only humans in Europe were Neanderthals, and people had not yet reached America. By about 70,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, began moving into Southeast Asia, where they would probably have encountered existing groups of archaic humans like Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, often referred to as the Hobbits, and possibly also the mysterious Denisovans. In May 2021, it was announced that researchers had used supercomputers to simulate 125 billion possible travel routes and reconstruct the most likely superhighways. The first humans to arrive in Australia used to navigate across this new land more than 65,000 years ago. The international team of scientists who undertook the research was led by researchers from the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage, CABAR, and recently revealed some of their methods to the press. They said, "We think people navigated in new territories much as people do today, by focusing on prominent land features protruding above the relative flatness of the Australian continent. To map these features, we built the most complete digital elevation model for Sahul ever constructed, including areas now underwater. We used this digital elevation model to understand what was visible to early travelers. Essentially, from each point in the continent we asked, 'What can you see from here?' This moving window calculates the largest viewshed map ever created. When our virtual travelers move, they reorient based on visible terrain everywhere they go." For their work, the researchers created an imaginary traveler, a 25-year-old woman carrying 10 kilograms of supplies to traverse the landscape. They collected all the various pieces of data they accumulated into a mega model known as From Everywhere to Everywhere, FEAT, and created over 125 billion possible pathways from every spot on the continent to everywhere else. Each route represented the easiest way to move from one location to another. Obviously, the researchers could not possibly examine every path of the 125 billion pathways that they had created, so they reduced the number by comparing all plausible pathways with the distribution of the oldest known archaeological sites on the ancient continent, providing weighted possibilities for each path. This work produced a scale of pathways going from the most likely to the least likely chosen paths. The most likely pathways in the map above are what the researchers called the superhighways of the first indigenous populations on the continent. The team's conclusion, drawn from their computer-generated maps, is that the early populations spread across the now submerged wide plains on the western and eastern margins of the continent and through to the region that now forms the Gulf of Carpentaria, the large shallow sea which now connects Australia to New Guinea. The nagging question of whether there was evidence that anyone had actually used these computer-identified highways in the remote past was soon answered by their research. A large number of archaeological sites in Australia, known to be at least 35,000 years old, were located on or near these superhighways, and many tracks also coincided with ancient trade routes known from the oral histories of the indigenous people, or agreed with genetic and linguistic studies used to trace early human migrations. But these superhighways may well have been much more than routes used for the initial peopling of Sahul. A number of these superhighways identified by the research team follow well-known Aboriginal trade routes which cross the country. These include the route from Cape York to South Australia via Birdsville, used by traders of Pituri native tobacco, and the trade of Kimberley Baler shell into Central Australia. There are also obvious similarities between the researchers' map of ancient highways and the most common trading and stock routes used by early Europeans, which is not surprising as they followed established routes long used by the Aboriginal peoples. The researchers' groundbreaking work on these superhighways has impressed the archaeological community. Archaeologist Kyle Bokinski of the University of Montana, Missoula, said, "This is a really compelling illustration of the power of using these simulation techniques at a huge continental scale to understand how people navigate landscapes. It's impressive, extreme computing." One intriguing aspect of this new research is that it has revealed major routes that cut across several dry areas in Australia's centre and in the northeastern state of Queensland. The existence of paths in such locations would appear to challenge the long-held view that the earliest people on the continent avoided the deserts. CABAR Deputy Director, Distinguished Professor Sean Ulm from James Cook University, commented on the importance of the research team's work in revealing the significance of landscape to the native inhabitants of the continent. He said, "Australia is not only the driest, but also the flattest populated continent on Earth. Our research shows that prominent landscape features and water sources were critical for people to navigate and survive on the continent. In many Aboriginal societies, landscape features are believed to have been created by ancestral beings during the dreaming. Every ridgeline, hill, river, beach and water source is named, storied and inscribed into the very fabric of societies, emphasizing the intimate relationship between people and place. The landscape is literally woven into people's lives and their histories. It seems that these relationships between people and the country probably date back to the earliest peopling of the continent. This quote brings in a question of a connection between these newly revealed superhighways and Aboriginal dreaming tracks. To the Aborigine, a dreaming track or songline, as it is also known, is a route taken by ancestral heroes in the dream time, in which all Aboriginal culture has its roots and before which, in their minds, the earth did not exist. As with the ancient superhighways, these mostly invisible paths or tracks usually connect Aboriginal sacred sites. In the dream time, groups of ancestral beings journeyed across the land, performing mighty deeds and creating the living species and features of the desert landscape. The adventure of these ancestors, also referred to as totemic ancestors, are chronicled in sacred songs, stories, and rituals. These totemic ancestors also established the rules of Aboriginal religion, law, moral systems, and social life. In the mind of the Aborigine dreamtime is a true record of how the landscape was formed, a landscape which is still inhabited by the spirits of their ancestor beings. By reenacting the myths in the dreamtime in song, story, and ceremony, the Aborigines keep their ancestors' rules, beliefs, and relationships with the landscape alive. The massive rock form of Ayers Rock, Uluru in the local Anagu language, is an isolated sandstone outcrop rising 1,140 feet above the Red Desert Plain in the Northern Territory of Central Australia, 208 miles southwest of Alice Springs. This sacred place is seen by the Anangu as a living record of the dreamtime activities of their ancestors, and the appearance and origin of every feature of the giant rock is present on the mental map carried around by the Anangu people of the area. One reason why the local Anangu population prefer tourists not to climb the rock is that the hiking path crosses one of the many traditional dreaming tracks on the site. Hopefully future work on possible connections between these fascinating superhighways and Aboriginal dreaming tracks might reveal important insights into the spiritual nature of both. The ancient Thracians of the southeastern Balkans are most commonly known for the astounding gold and silver artifacts found in burial sites from around the 12th century BC to the 6th century AD. Despite the fact that they were brilliant poets, artists, metalsmiths and musicians, there was almost no written history to be found of them. Who were these people and where did they come from? The history of the Thracians. The Thracians were a mysterious group of Indo-European tribes who inhabited large parts of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, mainly in the Balkans, but were also located in Asia Minor and other areas of Eastern Europe. They spoke the Thracian language, a rare and unique branch of the Indo-European language family. Although their origins are shrouded in mystery, archaeological evidence suggests the Thracians occupied the region since at least 1300 BC. The first known written account of the Thracians comes from Homer's Iliad, probably dating to the 8th century BC, where they are depicted as powerful soldiers fighting on the side of Troy. In 512 BC, a vast part of southern Thrace came under the rule of Darius I, the great king of Persia, though it proved to be a problematic and unstable province for the Persian Empire. In the 5th century BC, Greek historian Herodotus described the Thracians in Book 5 of his Histories. The Thracians are the most powerful people in the world, except, of course, the Indians, and if they had one head, all were agreed amongst themselves, it is my belief that their match could not be found anywhere, and that they would very far surpass all other nations. But such union is impossible for them, and there are no means of ever bringing it about. Herein, therefore, consists their weakness. The Thracians bear many names in the different regions of their country, but all of them have like usages in every aspect, excepting only the Getae. The Trausi in all else resemble the other Thracians, but have customs at births and deaths which we'll now describe. When a child is born, all of its kindred sit around in a circle and weep for the woes it will have to undergo now that it has come into the world, making mention of every ill that falls to the lot of humankind. When, on the other hand, a man has died, they bury him with laughter and rejoicings, and say that he is now free from a host of sufferings and enjoys the completest happiness. The Thracians, who live above the Crestonaians, observe the following customs. Each man among them has several wives, and no sooner does a man die than a sharp contest ensues among the wives upon the question which of them all the husband loved most tenderly. The friends of each eagerly plead on her behalf, and she to whom the honour is adjudged, after receiving the praises of both men and women, is slain over the grave by the hand of her next of kin, and then buried with her husband. The others are solely grieved, for nothing is considered such a disgrace. After the Persians, Thracian tribes were conquered again in the late 4th century BC by Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great. But it was after the area became part of the Roman Empire that historians began to lose all trace of the Thracians. Some believe that the Thracian tribes were assimilated by the Romans and later the Bulgarians. Spartacus. Undoubtedly, the most famous Thracian was Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator who led a slave revolt against Rome in the 1st century BC. In southern Italy between 73 and 71 BC, he led an army numbering tens of thousands and defeated Roman forces over half a dozen times until he was killed in battle in April 71 BC. Spartacus seems to have served in a Roman auxiliary unit for a time before deserting to become a bandit and a rebel against the Romans. At some stages he was captured, brought to Rome, and sold as a slave to a man called Vatia. Vatia owned a gladiator school in Capua, about 120 miles southeast of Rome. While being trained at the school, Spartacus helped organize a breakout that led to more than 70 gladiators escaping armed with knives, cleavers, and other crude weapons they stole from the kitchen. One of the people who escaped with Spartacus was his wife, a Thracian woman whose name is unfortunately unknown. Ancient Greek writer Plutarch, who lived from 46 AD to around 120 AD, wrote that she was a prophetess who was possessed by ecstatic frenzies that were part of the worship of the god Dionysus. On one occasion, when Spartacus woke up with a snake coiled around his head, she declared that this was a sign of a tremendous and fearsome power that would bring him to an unfortunate end. Thracian wine. Although the Thracians remain an enigma, they left behind exquisite traces of their culture. They were well known in the ancient world as wine-making masters and had numerous important rituals and cults associated with wine. The Thracians worshipped a god named Zagreus, Dionysus, the god of wine as the Greeks knew him, and Bacchus as he was known to the Romans. Wine was a sacred drink in their society and was initially used in rituals connecting man with the divine. Ancient Greek authors, however, described the Thracians as drinkers and barbarians as they drank non-diluted wine. For the Greeks at the time, the civilized way to drink wine was diluted with water. Incredible gold artifacts. The Thracians were able to extract gold and silver from the mountainous area of their homeland, mainly the Rhodopes, a mountain range with most of its area in southern Bulgaria, though a part lies within the borders of modern Greece. Some of the most ancient gold mines in the Balkans, with galleries over 1,700 feet long, still exist in the eastern Rhodopes. The Thracians were renowned for producing fine jewelry and ornaments, and there have been over 80 impressive gold Thracian treasures discovered in Bulgaria alone. Most of the treasures excavated in the territory of modern Bulgaria consist of wine-drinking and preparation vessels. The images on these ancient Thracian vessels illustrate wine rituals and feasts. The Rogozan treasure is the largest treasure in terms of weight ever to have been found in ancient Thrace, with a total weight of over 20 kilograms. It consists of 165 silver items, of which 108 of them are phials, 54 jugs and 3 cups. Archaeologists have dated the treasure to between the end of the 6th to the 4th century BC. It has been theorized that the treasure belonged to the local Thracian ruler, as on some of the vessels have been inscribed with the name of the Orydician king Cotys I. The gold treasure is the largest Thracian gold treasure ever discovered in Bulgaria. It consists of 9 vessels of 88% pure gold and a total weight of 12.5 kilograms. According to archaeologists, the priceless artifacts date from the end of the Bronze Age, 1600 to 1200 BC. This is the period of the Thrace described in Homer's Iliad. Experts believe that the gold vessels were used in the cult practices of the Thracian king priests. One curious and extremely interesting fact about the small cups from the treasure is that they were made in such a way that they stand still only when full of wine, otherwise they wobble. The tomb of Shvestari was discovered in 1982 near the village of Shvestari. It is an extremely rare 3rd century BC decorated monumental Thracian tomb and is probably the grave of Dromicetes, who lived from around 300 to 280 BC. He was the king of the Getae on both sides of the lower Danube, in present-day Romania and Bulgaria. In 2012, archaeologists discovered important Thracian treasure in the area when they excavated a large number of 4th century BC tombs near the village. Finds from the tombs included a golden ring, 44 female figures, and 100 golden buttons.
The ancient Sumerians were once a flourishing civilization that existed thousands of years ago in a region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which is now known as southern Iraq. The origins of this advanced community in Mesopotamia are still widely debated today, but there is substantial archaeological evidence that indicates they had established around a dozen city-states by the 4th millennium BC. These cities usually consisted of a walled metropolis that surrounded a commanding superstructure or ziggurat, tiered pyramid-shaped temples, which are acknowledged in association with the Sumerian religion. Homes were built from bundles of marsh reeds or mud bricks, as the region had few trees and almost no stone or metal, forcing the ingenious use of natural materials such as clay. Sumerian architecture and engineering were to such a high standard that they constructed complex irrigation canals to harness the silt-encumbered waters of the Tigris and Euphrates for its many uses, including farming. The oldest and most extensive of Sumerian cities was Uruk, a prosperous trading core that was surrounded by 6 miles of defensive walls and contained a population of between 40 and 80,000 citizens. It is estimated that at its peak around 2800 BC, Uruk was more than likely the largest city in the world. The ancient Sumerians certainly had an aptitude for technological inventions, and were very adept at perfecting the large-scale use of old ones. They are the founding civilization for much of the knowledge that we still use today. Among some of their inventions, such as the wheel, the plough, and writing, Sumerian mathematics and measurements are still the origin of many parts of our everyday lives today. The source of our concept of time in minutes and seconds can be traced all the way back to Sumeria, as the culture mainly used a sexagesimal structure that was based around groupings of 60, much in the same way that modern mathematics uses a decimal structure based on the number 10. Later, the ancient Babylonians adopted this easily divisible number system to calculate the celestial lengths of months and years. Base 60, as it is now known, eventually became redundant, but its legacy is forever entombed in the way we time our lives on a day-to-day basis. Other vestiges of the Sumerian sexagesimal system have endured in the form of spatial measurements, such as the measurement of 12 inches in a foot and 360 degrees in a circle. With all that said, why is it that we give such credibility to their inventions, but we don't offer the same to the content of the 14 ancient Sumerian tablets that were discovered by British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard in 1849? To date, these are the oldest known texts and were created somewhere between 2300 and 2400 BC. The information that has been deciphered on the tablets shares many similarities with other ancient writings, but they do put a different spin on some other ancient texts. The initial decoding of the texts or cuneiform writings on the tablets was done by Henry Rawlinson, but scholars Julius Opert and Paul Haupt later took the lead in deciphering the Sumerian language, thus providing historians with their first ever glimpse of the ancient history and literature of early Mesopotamia. Within the writings is the mention of the Fathers of Beginnings, or ultimate supreme beings. The entire first 2 tablets describe who they were and where they were from. Tablet 3 tells of the 6 days of creation and refers to the human race as having been genetically manipulated by these beings that they worshipped as gods, that are referred to as the Anunnaki, a title many of us are familiar with today. This is, of course, in total contrast to the varying doctrines of evolution that we have been fed for the last 2,000 years. The texts provide a vast array of information that suggests that even the technological knowledge the Sumerians held was provided by these beings. The name Anunnaki is derived from the Sumerian god of the sky, An or Anu, and according to the legends in the tablets, these creator gods originally inhabited a distant orbiting planet called Nibiru, a planet that only entered our solar system every 3,600 years. It seems there is evidence of this 9th planet, and we can observe it when it comes close, but when it doesn't, the planet becomes one with the dark expanse of space. On the 4th of October 2017, NASA released an article called "The Super Earth That Came Home for Dinner." The article includes 5 different lines of observational evidence pointing to existence of a planet 9. Nibiru is described as being many times the diameter of Earth, and because of an abundance of iron oxide, it made its rivers and lakes appear red in colour. The legend continues to state that as Nibiru's atmosphere began to deteriorate, the planet became a hostile environment to sustain life, and in order to restore their atmosphere, the Anunnaki needed a fundamental element: gold. It is poignant to note that although there is a plethora of more precious minerals on our planet than gold, it is evident that almost all ancient civilizations revered this one element more than any other, and treated it to be almost godly in origin. The question so is, why? There is scientific proof that gold nanoparticles can be used to repair damaged ozone, but how would those creators in ancient times know this? It is widely accepted that NASA use gold-foiled textiles on their space stations and landers as protection, as it shields from radiation. The Anunnaki, it seems, also were aware that there were 8 planets in our solar system, and they discounted Pluto, as we have also done within the last couple of decades. The narrative of the tablets continues to say that the Anunnaki have spent hundreds of thousands of years on Earth, and that during this time they created a gold mining settlement. They even state that a leader by the name of Enki oversaw an Earth station in the Persian Gulf. The cuneiform tablets also narrate that the deities arrived in a huge ship that descended from heaven, bringing with them another inferior extraterrestrial race to work as their slaves mining gold for the Anunnaki. This slave race was well documented and correlates with Babylonian chronicles from the 1700s BC. The mining of gold was a torturous and exerting effort, and the gods oversaw the removal of vast quantities with total disregard to the well-being of the slaves. After many years the slaves attempted to overcome their oppressive masters. A failed rebellion ensued, and caused an almost complete annihilation of the inferior race. This in turn left the Anunnaki without a workforce to complete the task. Unable to replace their labour pools, the Anunnaki king ordered his son Enki to genetically engineer a new slave race, one that had the intellect to perform complex and detailed work, but one that would also be subservient to their godly masters. Enki's experiments were well documented, and many unique life forms were created, including the successful creation of a genetic hybrid between Earth's inhabitants, Homo erectus, and the Anunnaki, and thus was the genesis of Homo sapiens, or primitive man. The tablets called this creation the first man, and it is interesting to note that in the Bible Adam was the first man, and the Akkadian meaning for Adamu is to make. The Anunnaki put these first men to work in the mines throughout Mesopotamia, and so it was that another slave race was to dedicate their lives to working for the gods. This was known as workship, which eventually became what we know it as today, worship, or worship of God or gods. According to the Sumerian pictographs and texts, the Anunnaki lived for centuries and were giants in comparison to Homo sapiens. This new slave race's whole purpose in life was to humbly serve the gods, and in return they were gifted with social skills and knowledge of academics, mathematics, and technology. Originally sterile, the race had to be re-engineered as the demand for more workforce increased, and with time the population rose to such excess that many humans were banished from the protection of the Anunnaki cities, and many speculate that this is where the story of Adam and Eve being banished from the Garden of Eden came from, banished from paradise for procreating. The subservient humans evolved and became more intelligent, and the story says that some Anunnaki leaders bred with human women. The children that were born from these forbidden unions between the two races came to be called the Nephilim, the sons of gods. Early writings from the Greeks also refer to such unions producing demigods. The Sumerian tablets continue to say that these unions between human and Anunnaki outraged the Anunnaki king, and he wanted to prevent any mere human from rising to a position of power and threatening what he had created. However, even the king had no dominion over nature, and the human population continued to increase in large numbers over the following millennia, but Mother Nature had her own population control plan in store. During one of its 3,600-year cycles, the Nibiru's orbit created havoc on the Earth and the Sun. This would correlate with often referring to it as the Destroyer when it appeared throughout many ancient texts, all from around the world. The passing of comets over Earth usually has no effect or cause any disturbance, but the tablet that contains Epic of Gilgamesh describes one cataclysmic event when one collided with Earth. The text reads, "The skies roared with thunder, and the earth heaved. Then came darkness and a stillness like death. Lightning smashed the ground and fires blazed out. Death flooded from the skies. When the heat died and the fires went out, the plains had turned to ash." According to the texts, the Anunnaki king saw the oncoming disaster as an opportunity to rid the planet of humans, and he returned to his planet, leaving those of his race that chose to stay. It is said that he and his subjects witnessed the chaotic flooding and destruction of our planet from their celestial boats that circled the earth. Then there was a darkness at daytime, and at night the moon was swallowed, and the earth began to shake by a force before unknown. In the glow of dawn a black cloud arose from the horizon. The morning light turned to darkness. Then the sound of a rolling thunder boomed, and lightning lit the skies on that day. The deluge and war began. At that point the South's huge ice sheets collided and fell into the ocean. This in turn would have effortlessly created a culmination of tsunamis around the world. The tidal waves continued north and submerged the city of Eden, one of the first of the Anunnaki settlements on Earth, now located somewhere at the bottom of today's Persian Gulf. Witnessing the cataclysm from afar, the king's son Enki felt sorrow and compassion for his creations, and instructed his chosen followers to build boats. It is said that Noah was one of these such followers, and he was one of the Nephilim born from the forbidden union. Most of us know the story of the flood that follows, and the deluge is recorded in almost every civilization on our planet. Core samples taken from Greenland and Antarctica provide evidence that suggests the sea levels were about 420 feet lower than they are today, and more importantly, there is a clear indication that there was a rapid rise in the water levels. When the deluge of water on the earth settled, the Anunnaki returned and began reconstruction once more. Ancient texts describe how this time they made their structures according to the position of the stars. It reads, "At the heart of the plane the heavens reflect." Many theories believe this passage of text refers to the Egyptian pyramids and other ancient sites with regard to alignment to the stars. When the Anunnaki finally left Earth, their influence had reached every corner of the world. Before they left, their gift to humanity was the Sumerian civilization, a mature and highly advanced, organized culture that seems to have suddenly just existed. They taught them about hierarchy and the establishment of a monarchic society. The human Sumerian kings would act and rule the people in accordance with the ancient Anunnaki principles. They respected a royal bloodline and recorded who the Nephilim were and how they came to be. The idea of preserving bloodlines carried on through the millennia, even to the point of incestual breeding. Some speculate that this was a deliberate and deceptive way to distantly manage the control of Earth through the selective breeding of its nobility over the eons. Others hypothesize that if we follow what the tablets indicate, then Nibiru may once again reappear close to Earth, and the Anunnaki will return and reinstate their rule over the slave race they created. With all this said, we go on about our lives waiting on the 3,600-year cycle of Nibiru to approach Earth once again, and whether we give the stories in the Sumerian tablets any credence or not, scientists have released information stating that they are aware of a large hidden celestial body within our solar system. They refer to this body as Planet X.
As we all know, as a species we're called Homo sapiens. Homo meaning mankind, sapiens meaning wise, despite, if you follow world news, there being some doubt about it. The reason for the existence of mankind, Homo, is a well-rehearsed debate, typically between Darwinism and the divine. Less familiar is the consideration of sapiens. Just where did our seemingly superior intellect, knowledge and wisdom come from? There are various theories about this. Let's take a close look at some of them. There have been many attempts to explain both the intellectual development of the human race and how it first appeared here on Earth. It has frequently been suggested that the creation of humanity's intellect was not a fluke brought on by a random pooling of chemicals which, over millennia, just happened to coalesce into the complexity of DNA, leading eventually to the expansion of the cortex. Rather, the alternative theory suggests that, for some reason, humanity as we now know it is the result of direct genetic manipulation by races not indigenous to this world. The genesis and evolution of humanity's curiosity, intelligence, and inherent ability to absorb knowledge is not so well known. While much of humanity's intellectual development came about as a natural process, there still remains the impression that there exists a seminal motherlode of information hidden in various locations dotted around the world. This archive is allegedly concealed in so-called libraries, each containing separate elements of this knowledge, esoteric and otherwise, that we as a species require to survive and evolve. Periodically, perhaps in response to a specific need, some yet unknown mechanism percolates this information inconspicuously into the public domain and is disseminated into the world at large. Perhaps this reservoir of hidden knowledge has been responsible for every critical watershed in human evolution, from the development of language, to the invention of the wheel, to the discovery of nuclear fission, and every technological and humanitarian advance in between. Is it possible that the flashes of supposed inspiration that occur in scientific research, for example, are on some mystical one-to-one basis, randomly favouring individuals like Newton, Einstein and Feynman? Conversely, it has been speculated that the method is more deliberate and is controlled by a very select few individuals who have access to these storehouses of information. This vital data may have been handed down through the lineage of these especially selected, genetically modified families whose hidden agenda is the stewardship of civilization itself. If this is the case, then it is also likely that there is a measure of fail-safe built into the arrangement. So, for reasons of security and continuity of access, these families are unknown to one another, each only having knowledge of their own particular point of access. This, as I'm sure you're aware, is typical of the cell structure used in secretive organizations the world over. And by their very nature, the location of these libraries is the most closely guarded secret of all time. One such library is known as the Akashic Records, and were allegedly made available to Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who, along with Colonel Olcott and later Annie Besant, founded a philosophical and mystical movement during the late 19th century known as Theosophy, which still exists today. Madame Blavatsky went on to produce The Secret Doctrine, a seminal work inspired by the Akashic Records, which was adopted as the cornerstone of theosophical teachings. Alternately, the hidden repositories have been called the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean, and are allegedly contained in certain books of the Torah that are supposedly written on tablets of sapphire. Another alleged source of this hidden wisdom was widely touted during the 1960s in the writings of a British journalist named Cyril Henry Hoskins, also known as T. Lobsang Rampa. Hoskins claimed that he was the reincarnation of a deceased Tibetan Lama, Lobsang Rampa, and obtained the inspiration and information for his books from this reincarnation. The works he had published, which included The Third Eye and The Cave of the Ancients, were full of mystical attributes and supernatural abilities that genuine Tibetan Buddhists rejected and continue to reject as a mixture of wishful thinking and downright nonsense. For example, in his book The Cave of the Ancients, he claimed that he had actually seen and entered a cave hidden high in the icy wastes of the Himalayas, where he discovered a cache of mysterious devices of unknown origin and purpose. The implication was that, while not necessarily extraterrestrial in origin, they were a legacy from a long-dead, technologically advanced civilization that predated humanity. Even today there's a hard core of believers who embrace Rampaism as a revealed truth from ascended masters, in much the same manner as the UFO-based Aetherius Society continues to accept the recorded messages channeled by its founder, the late Dr. George King, as originating from iconic spiritual entities including Christ, the Buddha, and Krishna. It's important to understand that, in common with Rampaism and other quasi-religious groups, the Aetherius Society directly equates benign religious figures like Christ with an inextricable amalgam of part spiritual, part extraterrestrial beings who are effectively interchangeable. Certain books of the Jewish Torah were supposedly originally inscribed on star sapphires. The structure of these crystalline gems, it is claimed, gives credence to Jewish culture. For example, when a gem cutter prepares a sapphire for cutting and polishing, he cleaves it along weak planes along its axis. When these are rounded off during polishing, some of the stones reflect a six-pointed star, the points of which intersect in the centre and extend right round the stone, the Star of David. A recent National Geographic magazine revealed that when a lightning bolt is viewed in cross-section, it too forms the Star of David, and this is apparently also true of a rainbow. These oddities of nature are taken by believers as positive proof that God's hand is present in the tenets of the Jewish faith. However, it is more likely that it demonstrates the harmony of nature rather than a particular religious belief. Before leaving this subject, it is as well to point out that two Jewish commentaries on the Bible, the Talmud and the Midrash, both assert that God created the Torah before he created the world. That being the case, then the Hebrew language was the original language of the planet, and each symbol of the language contains the essence of whatever it describes, and as such has real power. This may be the reason why many ancient grimoires and other books of magic were written in Hebrew. Does this, therefore, infer that the tablets of Thoth are also written in Hebrew? Turning now to the wisdom allegedly contained in the emerald tablets of Thoth, the god Thoth was said to have been a magician, geometrician, and surveyor. In addition, he was also the god of wisdom, writing, medicine, art and astronomy, and his priests and adherents even claimed that he created the universe using sound. This particular element of the mythology is derived from the opening of Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, which is taken to mean that it was the sound of the Word that initiated the process of creation. Vibration, resonance, and frequency. These are the three cornerstones of reality that continue to manifest their relevance and truth even today. Indeed, perhaps even more so today. Indeed, when the great electrical genius and visionary Nikola Tesla was asked if there was one fundamental secret in the universe, he unhesitatingly said, vibration, resonance, and frequency. Some corroboration that may link Thoth with both Egypt and a hidden store of knowledge comes from the Association for Research and Enlightenment, an organization created in Virginia, USA in 1931 to preserve and circulate the predictions made by Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet. One of Cayce's prophecies related to the Sphinx, or, more precisely, what was allegedly hidden below it. According to Cayce, there existed what he called the Hall of Records, and in this chamber, located deep below the bulk of the Sphinx, there was a treasure trove of information detailing the ancient knowledge of mankind that had been transferred from Atlantis at the time of the Great Flood. The Greeks associated Thoth with Hermes, to the point where the two were virtually indistinguishable, and eventually they morphed into Hermes Trismegistus, the supposed author of books on occult, philosophical and religious subjects, and also the progenitor of the word hermetic, meaning hidden or sealed. Ultimately, the dual entity, Thoth-Hermes, presented his wisdom to his successors as the Book of Thoth, or the Key of Immortality, which contained secret information capable of allowing the regeneration of humanity and the expansion of consciousness, thus allowing humans the ability to commune with their gods. While this information, though unusual, is just about within the realms of possibility, there are rather more extreme views on both Thoth and his emerald tablets. Perhaps predictably, the story also embraces both the pyramids and the legend of Atlantis, and the claim that Noah brought the emerald tablets to Egypt aboard his ark. This particular and extreme take on the Thoth mythos suggests that Thoth was an Atlantean who did not actually write the tablets, but took information that was already in existence and developed it. The information concerned the history of human development, reaching back into the mists of antiquity, and was first given to the ancient initiates and adepts who set about spreading the knowledge to all mankind. Eventually, Thoth created a school of mystery and selected individual priests to whom he taught the mysteries inscribed on the tablets. The priests then divided the tablets amongst themselves and, for safekeeping, took them individually to sites all over the world. This may be the origin of legends concerning unique families who, even to this day, preserve elements of humanity's past and future. Some versions of Masonic tradition seem to corroborate this, insisting that Thoth played a part in preserving their arcane knowledge and returning it to mankind after the flood. In addition to Hermes, Thoth also has been known to a number of civilizations by the following names. The Romans called him Mercury, the Mayans Quetzalcoatl, the Incas Viracocha, the Persians Zarathustra or Zoroaster, and the Gauls calling him Theaetetus. Perhaps the strangest part of all is where the encoded knowledge came from in the first place. Scriptural tradition tells us that it came from the Watchers, or fallen angels, who, along with their leader Satan, were cast out of heaven. According to Scripture, Armaros taught humanity the resolving of enchantments. Arakiel taught humanity the signs of the earth. Azazel taught humanity to make knives, swords and shields, and to devise ornaments and cosmetics. Barakajel taught humanity astrology. Ezekiel taught humanity the knowledge of the clouds. Gadriel introduced weapons of war. Kokabel taught humanity the science of constellations. Pinmu instructed humanity in writing and the secrets of wisdom. Sariel taught humanity the course of the moon. Semjaza taught humanity enchantments. Shamshiel taught humanity the signs of the sun. Assuming that this is the case, then it may be reasonable to assume that there was indeed some form of priming involved at the dawn of time, ensuring that our species developed intellectually in a way that increased the odds in favour of its survival. There was little point in creating an adaptable, non-specialised bipedal species if it had minimal intelligence. It is also likely that, rather than the fallen angels of Scripture, these may well have been a particular race of extraterrestrials with their own agenda. Rather than spiritual secrets, were we given language of technology designed to free us from the yoke of drudgery? Are these the real secrets inscribed on the tablets of Thoth? And do these scattered fragments contain a form of practical information to help restart the human race should some cataclysm befall it? If so, then where are they, and who are the families standing sentinel over them? If their purpose is to convey concepts of advanced technology, permitting contact with the entities that created us, then perhaps the information on these tablets might act rather like the monolith in Arthur C. Clarke's masterwork, 2001, A Space Odyssey, and signal our readiness to meet races and civilizations immeasurably more advanced and cultured than we, their unruly, quarrelsome, primitive children.
It was always thought that humans were the only known life form that used tools. It was unique to our hominid lineage, and a remarkable talent that separated us from the animals. So much for that idea. In fact, we've known for some years that our closest living relatives, chimps, employ a variety of tools, including some made of stone. Recently, primatologists have discovered that this also applies to two more distant cousins, the Capuchins and macaques living in the coastal regions of Thailand. The new findings have attracted some of the top archaeologists who are interested in the so-called Stone Age of non-human primates. Delving through layers of dirt, they have already begun to unearth the remains of tools made thousands of years ago by our ancestors and distant relatives. The discoveries usher in a new age of perspective, which gives us novel insight into our past. It is now possible to make archaeological comparisons for the first time regarding our own evolution compared to that of our nearest ancestors, and we can see what characteristics all tool wielders have in common. This could also be the missing link that further strengthens the argument regarding human history and where we came from. The gentleman at the forefront of primate archaeology is Michael Haslam from the University of Oxford. Dr. Haslam started out as a normal archaeologist, preoccupied with mainstream research. His epiphany moment came during a chance encounter with Dr. Bill McGrew, an expert in chimpanzee tool use from the University of Cambridge. The conversation got Dr. Haslam wondering what chimp technology might have looked like in the past. It just seemed like something that needed to be investigated, he says. We had all of these techniques from archaeology that help you understand the past, and they were only being applied to humans. In 2012, he then set up the Primate Archaeology Project, Primark. In 2007, Julio Mercader and others reported that they had discovered the remains of a 4,300-year-old chimpanzee settlement. There had been no further digs since then. But with the foundations of primate archaeology already laid in West Africa, Dr. Haslam decided to look across the Atlantic to Brazil, where evidence of tool use in wild Capuchins was just starting to emerge. Specifically, they were interested in tools used for nut cracking. A cashew is a tough nut to crack. You must carefully balance it on an anvil and bash it with a hammer while avoiding contact with the caustic resin in its shell. This takes great skill. Yet bearded Capuchin monkeys living in northeast Brazil make it look like child's play. When the team reached Brazil, they decided to start digging at the base of a tree where the monkeys kept a stock of stone tools, and less than a meter down, they found what they were after. Some of the stones resembled modern-day Capuchin hammers, which are much larger than the average rocks in the area. Others looked like anvils, which are 4 times the size of the hammers. Carbon dating put the tools at 700 to 1,000 years old, meaning they were in use well before the first Europeans arrived in the New World, thus making them the oldest non-human stone tools found outside Africa. Like the Thailand forest chimps, the monkeys have clearly been cracking nuts in the same way for a long time. The tools unearthed in both cases are remarkably similar to those used today, but that doesn't necessarily mean their technologies have stagnated since then. To put things in perspective, the sharp-edged stone flakes used by early hominids 2.6 million years ago are identical to those manufactured 1 million years later by their distant ancestors. Another behavior witnessed was the Capuchin monkeys often stopping to lick mineral dust off the rocks, ingesting the sharp particles to cut up intestinal parasites. We are still trying to figure out why exactly they're doing this and how they know why to do this. Further insights into the history of hominin tool use could come from studying the archaeological record of Burmese long-tailed macaques. Troops of these monkeys living on a series of islands off the west coast of Thailand use rocks predominantly to break open oysters, crabs, and sea snails, rather than nuts. This behavior was only discovered a decade ago, but when Dr. Haslam heard about it, he was eager to research it. This would prove trickier than the others, however. The big challenge with macaques is the sea. It washes away all the remains of their tool use. Waiting patiently for the tide to recede and macaques to emerge from their forest dwellings to forage along the rocky shoreline, they observed the monkeys placing their catches on big boulders and whacking them with rocks until the shells loosened and released the juicy meat inside. After their meal, the monkeys would retreat to the forest. At that point, the team swung into action, descending on the beach and digging as fast as they could. They could only excavate for a maximum of about 4 hours before the tide came back in, so that limited how deep they could go. Carbon dating of oyster shells in the deepest deposits revealed that they were less than 100 years old. But the trenches they dug contained telltale signs of much older use. Back in West Africa, Primark researchers found that their archaeological approach can help reveal how cultural traditions are maintained. For example, the Thai chimps live in communities favoring one of 2 nut-cracking tools. Some primarily use hammers made of stone, others prefer wooden clubs. These differences are maintained despite females frequently moving between groups. By studying the tools made in the past by females, but left behind when they migrate, it has been discovered that they tend to adopt the tool of choice of their new group, even if that means abandoning one they have spent years working with. This tendency to conform to local traditions is also an essential feature of human culture, and one that allows communities to retain their distinct customs despite an influx of migrants. In another fascinating study, the chimps are helping researchers work out what hominin used their tools for. The archaeological record is full of rocks that look like anvils, but no one knows whether a given slab was for cracking nuts, bones, or both. To address this question, archaeologists from the University College of London are collecting stones from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where early hominin tools have been found. They give these rocks to chimps living in a sanctuary, and the chimps use them as anvils until they accumulate unique damage patterns. A side-by-side comparison with anvils found at the hominin sites can then reveal if these were used for nut cracking or not. A similar approach could help with the problem of distinguishing ancient tools from stones damaged by natural forces. With 3 new tool users on the block, the primate archaeologists can also start to do comparative studies. Although there is no doubt that primate archaeology offers exciting new ways to peer into our own past, archaeologists caution against drawing too many conclusions. What we observe in a chimp did not necessarily happen in early hominins. They are not the same species. There are millions of years of evolution dividing them. That applies even more so to Capuchins and macaques, with which we share ancestors far further back. Nevertheless, primate archaeology has come a long way in the last few years.
For many centuries, the biblical version of how the human race began was so much easier to understand, simply because there was no other choice. There was the creation, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, Eve's temptation of Adam, which incurred God's wrath, and led to them being cast out of paradise. This blissful explanation was, at least in previous centuries, fairly easy to maintain, simply because people would not dare to question biblical teaching. Until the advent of Charles Darwin. Born in Shropshire to a wealthy family, Darwin attended an elite private school, from which he graduated to Edinburgh University to study medicine. This choice of career didn't suit him, so in 1827 he entered Cambridge with the intention of becoming a clergyman in the Church of England. While in Cambridge, Darwin met two men who proved pivotal in his career. They were Adam Sedgwick and John Henslow, one a geologist, the other a naturalist. From them, Darwin learned the skills and techniques of observation, plus collecting and mounting specimens. Graduating from Cambridge in 1831, aged only 22, Darwin was taken on board the English survey ship, the HMS Beagle, as an unpaid naturalist. It was during this voyage that he was, as a result of his findings, forced to confront the perceived wisdom of the era of the so-called catastrophist theory. This, along with the Bible, was the cornerstone of conventional creationist belief. All the fossils unearthed by archaeologists constituted the remains of those destroyed in previous disasters. In the view of the catastrophists and creationists, all species were created individually and were unchangeable. When he returned to England, Darwin set about recording his findings on changeability, finally culminating in his 1859 seminal work on the origin of species by means of natural selection. This work literally stood convention on its head. Even his later works, including The Descent of Man, didn't provoke the same outraged response. At first, there was a widespread condemnation from the churches and the scientific community, but gradually the theory was grudgingly accepted. However, this acceptance was not universal, particularly in America, where it led to court cases, most notably the famous 1926 Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, which caught the attention and imagination of the world. Proponents of the biblical creationist tradition went to court to prevent the theory of evolution being taught in schools. The evolutionist case was fought by the famous lawyer Clarence Darrow. He won, and the rest is history. Over time, through education and common sense, evolution and natural selection obtained respectability. One accepted wisdom was replaced by another, and at last there was a measure of consensus. Then another theory emerged, and in its scope it was even more unsettling than evolution. This theory suggested that we are not the children of this planet, and our origins did not begin here. Our ancestors came from the stars. This theory is every bit as revolutionary as Darwin's evolution, and ultimately it is of little consequence whether our genesis was achieved by natural or artificial means. What is important is that our creators must have been as genetically similar to us as we are to apes. Depending on how we interpret various biblical statements, especially in the Old Testament, there appears to be abundant mention of interference by extraterrestrials in the origins of modern humans. The Church seems to regard the Old Testament as a bit of an embarrassment, but the New Testament contains far fewer references of this kind. Bear in mind that the New Testament was made up from all available information in the form of the written and oral tradition. The written information was in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. For many centuries, the only people with any real education were in the service of the Church, and from their perspective, this was entirely acceptable since knowledge is power. It therefore seems safe to assume that the references to aerial anomalies in the Old Testament are there because the early censors did not understand what they were or perceive them as a threat to the status quo. There is a mass evidence in Genesis, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Book of Enoch, which suggests genetic tampering with the early hominids. Genesis 6 tells us the sons of God took wives of the daughters of men who gave birth to the Nephilim. Who or what were these sons of God? If they weren't angels, then what were they? Are we therefore descended from a race of extraterrestrials, the sky people referred to in the ancient traditions of many cultures, including the Mayans? We are also told, and it came to pass when man began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all that they chose. There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also after that. When the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old men of wisdom. This text is totally at odds with traditional creationist teachings, which make no mention at all of Nephilim or sons of God. In fact, there is no resemblance at all to this testament. The story of Adam and Eve tells us that God took a handful of dust and produced Adam, the first man. From Adam's side, God takes a rib, and suddenly we have Eve. Whether or not you interpret this as cloning and genetic manipulation is for our purposes neither here or there. According to all of these accounts, we and all of creation appeared after 6 days of God's labor, presumably in his image, and looking much as we do now. Therefore, by interference, God looks like us, or if not God, then our Creator. If the biblical version is to be accepted, there was nothing before these dates, nothing at all, a vacuum. All was void, according to the scripture. We now look exactly the same as we were at the point of creation. There was no evolution, no change. Astonishingly, this was accepted teaching until Darwin's theories of evolution and natural selection changed that and pushed back the date of our origins to around 300,000 years ago. Over millennia, we evolved from apes through Neanderthal man, so named after a skeleton found in the Neander Valley in Germany. The evolutionary process continued with Homo erectus, then Homo sapiens, and finally culminated in Cro-Magnon man. It's interesting to note that Neanderthal man had a brain size at least equal to, and in many instances larger than ours. Evidently brain size is no guarantee of survival. This presents a convenient explanation which neatly squares away the loose ends. What it does not do is explain why, relatively quickly, Homo erectus developed a large brain, 50% larger, the ability to use language, and had a modern anatomical structure. This seems to have been achieved in a far shorter timescale than normal evolution could achieve. There had to be intervention. What form did this intervention take? At first, there seems to be two possibilities. On one hand, we have the fallen angels, and on the other hand, there is direct manipulation by extraterrestrials. But perhaps these accounts are the same event described from different perspectives. The Book of Enoch tells us that 200 angels, also known as the Watchers, rebelled against heavenly laws that required them to accept human beings as their equal. After being either forcibly ejected or voluntarily leaving heaven, the Watchers took wives among human women. Their offspring were the Nephilim. According to the respected Hebrew researcher and author Zecharia Sitchin, the term Nephilim in Hebrew means those who have fallen. This in turn translates in Greek as gigantes, which is reminiscent of the biblical quotation, "In those days there were giants." These fallen angels, who were they? Conspicuous by its absence is the name Lucifer, the light bringer. This odd term for the Lord of Hell, the epitome of evil and wickedness, have always seemed curiously inappropriate, given entirely the wrong impression. The fallen angels are credited with teaching us various skills. These included working with metals, basic chemistry, and the use of cosmetics. The teachings of these skills raises a very awkward question. Why would angels, these ethereal creatures, have any need for skills like these? The people who recorded these events did not have the vocabulary to adequately describe what they were witnessing. Little wonder that a more advanced race with the apparent ability to descend from heaven were interpreted as gods and angels. In a number of books, the late researcher and author Zecharia Sitchin put forward the theory that there is nothing heavenly about it. We are descended from extraterrestrials. According to him, we are the products of genetic manipulation by a race known as the Anunnaki. He states that this word translates as those who from heaven to earth fell. He goes on to claim that there is a 12th planet, Nibiru, which comes within range of Earth every 3,600 years. The technology of this race, when they first came here, was not at all that far ahead of our own as it is just now. He bases this on biblical accounts of vehicles that roared and belched flame. These seem similar to what our technology has produced in terms of space-going vehicles that have taken us to the moon and carry experimental craft around in and out of the solar system. Presumably, the science of this race would now be way ahead of ours, and it would be arrogant of us to presume that our ability to understand it is any better than that of our forefathers. Sitchin claims that our technology has taken a step change every 3,600 years, which coincides with both the arrival of this mysterious planet Nibiru within our solar system and contact with its inhabitants. One fascinating common thread running through all of these theories and opinions is that they all point to one thing. We were visited in the dawn of history by a race that was not from this world. They have different names, as do the results of their genetic meddling. Fallen angels, Anunnaki, Nephilim, Elohim and Titans. They all amount to the same thing. The only difference is the point of view and level of technology of the observers. In the final analysis, it doesn't matter what they were called. We are the descendants, their children, and perhaps one day we will meet our parents. And who knows, perhaps we already have.